Okay, hi there, and welcome to another in our series of short videos looking at how to build a really good answer for an A-level economics exam using both analysis and evaluation. This time we're going to take a look at a question which asks students to examine two policies to improve the mobility of labour to tackle labour immobility. This tends to be a question where it's very easy to fall into generalities and vagueness and superficiality. It's important to be specific because that really helps, as we'll see in a few minutes. That helps the evaluation. Here's our question. Examine two policies a government might use to tackle labour market immobility. Now, if you've done your revision, I think you'll know there are two main causes of immobility, occupational and geographical. It makes sense when structuring your answer, when putting the answer together, just to start with one, work through it, then look at the other. You don't necessarily need an introduction to the key terms. It'll be obvious if you know what you're talking about. Here's my first KAA paragraph, knowledge, application, analysis. I start with a definition. Occupational immobility occurs when there are hurdles, barriers facing people who are active in the labour market when they're looking to move from one job to another, or perhaps they're unemployed for structural reasons and they're finding it difficult to find new work. And crucially, occupational immobility is a major cause of labour market failure and of course can bring about persistent long-term structural unemployment. So this is an important one. Get straight to the point as soon as you can. One intervention is, in my case, the apprenticeship levy, which applies to, I think, all firms in the UK with a payroll of more than £3 million per year. And these firms have to pay 0.5% of their payroll into a general fund, and they must also release staff for professional development courses, perhaps one day a week. And the aim of the apprenticeship levy is to provide a degree of compulsion, first of all, to increase funding for training and education and improve professional development, but also to provide a degree of compulsion, because oftentimes firms are very happy to take workers who've been trained by somebody else without necessarily making a contribution to the cost of that. So this is hoping to overcome what economists call the free rider problem. That's when businesses, firms have invested in the human capital of their workforce, often younger people, and they find some of their most valuable employees pinched, snatched by rival firms who then get the benefit without contributing to the cost. So my policy is the apprenticeship levy, and it's designed to increase funding of training and overcome the free rider problem. Then leave a couple of lines on your exam script. Make it clear that you're making a distinction between analysis and evaluation. Here's my first evaluation point. In theory, an apprenticeship levy can be an effective way of improving human capital and giving workers the transferable skills that they need in a fast-changing world of work. But in practice, the scheme is at risk of government failure. Bring in the idea of government failure. For example, in 2018, just last year, the apprenticeship levy raised £2 billion, but actually firms only accessed £200 million of it, 1/10. And the number of apprenticeships actually in the UK, having risen in recent times, has actually fallen just in the last few years. So it's not necessarily working as intended. That's evaluation. Indeed, some firms complain that the quality of the training on offer if they outsource to training providers is not as good as it should be. It's subprime. And the employees themselves, people who might be receiving the training, may feel that vocational qualifications are still undervalued in the labour market. Although the government is bringing, or has brought in, the more rigorous T-level qualifications, technical level qualifications, to try and address that problem. So my evaluation point is that the scheme isn't as effective as it might have been. Most of the money isn't used, and there are doubts and concerns about the quality of the training. So that's good evaluation. And crucially, everybody, it's evaluating the point I've made. It's not a kind of generic point about time lags and opportunity costs. That's not going to get you high-level analysis, high-level evaluation. You need to evaluate the point you've made. Here's a little example to show that the number of apprenticeships in manufacturing and engineering industries has actually fallen in the last few years, having peaked at nearly 80,000 apprenticeships in 2016. My second point then switches focus to look at geographical immobility of labour. And that, of course, occurs when there are costs, hurdles, barriers, if you like, facing people who need to move location to find new work. Crucially, it's good to just target the issue. Think about who is most affected by this. And geographical immobility tends to particularly affect families on relatively low income. Younger people are often geographically mobile. They don't have family ties. They probably don't have a house. But particularly families on low incomes find it very difficult to move location. Immobility is often the consequence of a big disparity in housing costs across the regions, both houses to buy and also to rent as an alternative. A nice bit of application there in London. Average rents, if you can't afford to buy, if you have to rent, now over 50% of median post-tax incomes, disposable incomes. One policy approach. Now here, what I'm trying to do in this point is I'm trying to put in a little cluster of policies which probably aren't worth one separate paragraph each, which I think together could be a policy approach. So I'm saying that we need to reform the housing market to improve geographical mobility. So here's my phrase. It's on the screen there. One policy approach would be, or could be, might be, housing reforms involving a combination, so putting a little series of policies together, of scaling back planning regulations, perhaps a new tax on the capital value of land, where people have got planning permission but haven't developed the land into property, and also perhaps a higher stamp duty on people who buy a second home. The aim of this policy will be to increase the number of new homes being built and new homes being completed, to increase the supply of housing. Now, just saying that, hopefully you can immediately think of an analysis diagram showing an outward shift of the supply of housing, causing a fall in the average price, which makes housing more affordable and therefore increases mobility of labour. This is the chart which is sometimes associated with something called generation rent. People whose dream of buying a house is a fairly distant one. If you look at the ratio of median house prices in England and Wales to the average earnings of people in work, the rate was 3.5 in 1997, a bit lower in Wales. In England, 2016 it had gone up to 7.72 in England, 5.79 in Wales. In other words, the average house price, the median house price in England, nearly 8 times average earnings. Very, very hard to get a mortgage to afford that kind of property. Then you have to evaluate. So having done the analysis, leave a couple of lines, start an evaluation point, evaluation paragraph. The chronic supply of shortage of housing needs to be addressed, to be tackled. However, there are risks and drawbacks with this approach. So what I'm trying to do is I'm saying we need more housing to be built. That's the key. My evaluation is saying, well, there could be problems with this. One, what type of housing is being built? Is it being built targeted at younger people who can afford it? What percentage of new homes meets the price range for housing to be affordable? Will housing developers, the construction companies, instead focus their money on properties that gentrify an area without tackling the main cause of housing needs for families on low incomes? And building homes, of course, doesn't necessarily address the problems caused by lots of second homes, people with 2 or 3 homes, and also homes that are empty, homes which are built and available to be used. If they're not used, that is clearly allocatively efficient. So my evaluation point here is to challenge and question the idea that simply building more homes is the pathway to improving geographical mobility. I am evaluating that point rather than moving into sort of generic evaluation. Okay, thanks for joining in this video on policies to improve the mobility of labour.